here at the Kennedy School at the Institute of Politics, and it's the month of March in 2003, and we're here talking with Governor Jane Swift, former governor of Massachusetts, and with a Kennedy School graduate, Jenny Armini, who worked for Governor Swift. Just a word about background. Jane Swift was the first woman to become governor of the state of Massachusetts. She served in that office from April 2001 until January 2003, a period of some 18 months. And in a state which has seen very few women serve in positions of high office. We've never had a senator from this state until now who has been a woman. We've only had 3 members of the House of Representatives who have been women from the state of Massachusetts. A surprise, perhaps, to many from a state who's considered as progressive as Massachusetts. And Jane Swift was a Republican governor. Jenny Armini graduated from the mid-career program here at the Kennedy School in 2001 in June of that year, and very rapidly thereafter went to work for Governor Swift and was both her principal speechwriter and increasingly a confidant during that time, and is now back in the private sector and with motherhood nearby. So we're delighted to welcome both of them here and for a conversation about leadership with a particular emphasis upon women and leadership. So Jane Swift, perhaps it would be helpful for those who are watching if you could first briefly retrace your path in politics, your ascent to the governorship, what happened, and where you are now.
Sure. I was elected to the state senate from my hometown area, North Adams, Massachusetts, which is in the far northwest corner. I represented 45 small cities and mostly towns in western Massachusetts. I was elected in 1990.
How old were you then?
I was 25.
25 years old, okay.
Too young to be aware of some of the challenges perhaps that I was taking on. There's, for your younger students, there's great value in taking on these enormous challenges in your 20s because you're somewhat undaunted by the odds. But in my case, I had worked for the state senator for 2 years, and he decided not to seek re-election, encouraged me. I came from a somewhat political family in that my father and mother had been volunteers and active volunteers on political campaigns.
Had you been to school in that area, or that was where you were?
It's where I was born and grew up. My dad's family ran a small plumbing company. So my grandfather's name was on the side of plumbing trucks, so that was no doubt helpful. But the secret weapon in my early campaigns was my mother, who had been a teacher until the birth of my older brother, and then was the volunteer extraordinaire in Girl Scouts, schools, and the Catholic Church. And in our region of the district, pretty much everybody knew and liked my mom, and I think some of them, her name's Jean and I'm Jane, I think some of them were very disappointed when they realized they'd elected me and not her in that first.
And was your name Swift? Was your grandfather's name Swift? Was the name on the truck Swift?
Yes. So that currency worked well.
Yeah, let me ask you this before we go further then. There's a good deal of research about male leaders, especially presidents, that suggests the successful ones have had strong mothers. But there's been a suggestion that for women who have ascended in positions of leadership, that's often dependent upon having a strong father. Mm-hmm. And I wondered, in your case, your mother seems to have played a very significant role. But I
think it's both.
How that worked out. Yeah.
I will tell you, I think the key components as we get further into the interview, I think at times it's come back to bite me, but my father's family was very patriarchal. I worked in the plumbing company, but I was not allowed to work as a plumber's assistant like my brothers were, but I worked in the office. My father bent the rules a little bit in emergencies and let me deliver parts to work sites when I was the only one who could drive a standard shift vehicle, and the parts had to get there or the whole job would stop. But pretty much my grandfather's view was a very traditional view. My mom, I think, came from a very traditional immigrant family that helped my father to expand that view. But I think my parents themselves, great value, and as a parent I think about these things a lot, were that they really raised us to be gender blind in terms of our ambitions, our talents, and what we could succeed. I cannot ever remember either of my parents conveying to me that there was something I wanted to do or I thought I should do that I should not or could not because of my gender. It just was a non-entity, which is a little strange considering that Title IX was passed when I was playing high school basketball, and so I was one of the first beneficiaries of new uniforms for the girls' team because the guys needed warm-up, so they had to spend money on the girls too. But I think that was very helpful for not in any way dampening my anticipation of what I could do. It had its downfalls and naivete. I didn't realize when I decided to run for the state senate that there had never been a woman elected to either branch of the state legislature for my county. And I didn't realize until after I was elected that I was only the 13th woman to ever serve in the state senate in Massachusetts in 2000.
Wow.
Numbers 13 and 14 were elected when I was elected in 1990, which came as a complete shock to me. Now, had my parents raised me to be aware of these things, maybe those would have been fairly intimidating things to know beforehand. I have this great line in my bio that I was the youngest woman ever elected to the state senate, and I always say to people, that's great until you find out even today I think we're up to 21. So it's not that tough to be the youngest of 20. People assume there were hundreds and hundreds, and I beat them all under the wire.
Two things I want to clarify briefly. The family, an immigrant family from?
Italy. Now, it's Italy now. It was Austria.
I see, and it came when?
The early 1900s.
I see. So your granddad...
My grandmother came between World War I and World War II.
I see. And
my grandmother was 9 years old. She was the oldest.
And the Swift grandfather?
Forever back to the Mayflower, Protestant Irish.
Oh, so this is an amalgam of the two lines together. I see. Yeah, all right. And then when you grew up in Western Massachusetts and you went to college?
In Hartford. So I went away to college. I went through the public schools in North Adams.
Yeah.
Fuels my passion for public school improvement because it granted me access to one of the finest public liberal or private liberal arts colleges in the country, Trinity. In Hartford.
Yeah, and then you came back, and soon thereafter, after working in the plumbing company, you soon thereafter...
Actually, I worked in the plumbing company during school. I worked in retail in Hartford for a year, and then, for all the wrong reasons, came back to work for the state senator from my hometown, who I knew, who my father had been involved in his campaigns about a year out of college.
Right, all right, yeah. So you go to the state legislature, and how were you received there?
It was actually good timing. In 1990 was the wave of republicanism when Bill Weld was elected. It shocked the political establishment. It's interesting to me that there will be some younger class members who will see this who only remember Massachusetts with Republican governors, but in 1990 we had a long drought of Republicans in the corner office all the way back to Frank Sargent, I believe, in the 70s, so decades.
That's interesting. Let me just, could you ask them if they could, So the wave of Republicans comes to...
So Bill Weld gets elected.
Right.
He has what our current governor does not have, which was a veto-sustaining minority in the Massachusetts Senate. The Massachusetts Senate went from having 9 Republican senators out of 40 to having 16 as a result of the outcome of the election. I was well positioned because I was a member of this large freshman class of senators. We almost outnumbered the incumbents, but I had relationships having been a staff member with the incumbents.
Yeah. And so this was a part-time job for you?
No, it was full-time.
Full-time job.
It was a full-time job.
And how long did you remain in the Senate?
6 years.
And did you work your way up during that?
I did. I was appointed to the Ways and Means Committee, which was a great appointment in my first term, and then into leadership in my second term.
How did you make it from Ways and Means into leadership? How hard was that?
Not as hard as it would have been if I was a Democrat, because there were 5 leadership positions, and by the time I was in leadership, there were 9 members of our caucus. We shrank dramatically after that first big success.
So there were out of the 9, there were 5 leaders out of the 9 people.
I was very savvy, David. I was the swing vote for each camp had 4 votes. The 4 people who are going to be paid. I hooked my star with a fellow Western Mass folks. I was his fifth vote to win the leadership position, and miraculously, soon thereafter, a fifth paid spot was created.
Yeah. It was paid. The leadership position was paid?
Yeah.
And the non-leadership positions were
Not paid. So this really determined the outcome of elections, as you can imagine.
I can imagine.
But I mean, let's be fair. On the Democratic side, every Democrat in the Massachusetts Senate is in a paid leadership position.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there's the only people who aren't getting extra pay are the Republicans not in leadership, and comedy between the parties. We seem to address those inequities.
I understand. Okay, so you move into a leadership position, and you serve there for 4 years in a leadership position, and then what happened?
I run for Congress.
Okay, and
I lose, which was awful. I didn't like it.
It was a close race.
It was a close race. Why did you lose?
Because Bob Dole ran for president and topped the ticket, and my youthful arrogance didn't acknowledge that if the top of the ticket got beat by 37 points, that was tough to overcome. And also,
the Dole ticket lost by 37 points in Massachusetts.
in my district, and I lost by 5.5 or 6. I did better than Bill Weld did that year, but North Adams is a fairly rough and tumble blue collar city. Losing's losing. So a lot of people admired. Newt Gingrich was still the head of Congress, and he had 11% approval ratings in my congressional district. So there was
This was 1996.
This was not a good year to run as a Republican in Massachusetts for a federal.
Bill Clinton made a comeback in 1996
Yes.
as president.
Yes, with some brilliant advice from
Dick Morris.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Dick Morris actually advised Bill Weld and Republican senators like me in '92.
Yeah, well, Dick Morris is
A different story.
That's a whole different
Yeah.
story. Well, let's not go there.
Yeah.
He's a fascinating figure.
Yeah.
So with that, did you think your political career was at an end, or was it just in a detour?
No, I thought it was I thought my elected political career was at an end because I'm from North Adams. It's the small city in the Commonwealth. You don't run statewide because you have no power base.
Right.
A lot of people would love for me to run again for the same seat. I don't have that gene. I thought I'd given the incumbent a very good fight, and I also knew that, at least was on hold. My political career was on hold for a long period of time. I made the choice of positions within the administration to take based on a private sector segue calculus, not a political calculus, which is why I went to our Port Authority, because it was a private, public-private kind of entity that I thought would have and did have a lot of ability to garner me skills that would help me then make the next step into the private sector.
I see. So you had an appointment from the governor, from
Yes.
the Republican governor,
Right.
Bill Weld,
Right.
to put you into the Port Authority
Right.
in Boston.
Right. And then 9 months later, then Governor Cellucci, because Bill Weld had resigned on his quixotic quest for Mexico or something, Paul Cellucci, actually, they never told story, only 3 people, my husband, one of my closest political advisors, and I know this, but in September of 1997, I'd been at the Port Authority for 6 months, Paul Cellucci called me, asked me if I'd run for Congress again. I said no. Asked me would I ever consider running for statewide office. I said I didn't think it was realistic, but that if he ever needed me to take on a particular role, that would help him to be elected to a full term in his own right. I thought it was a very important election to get our third sort of holding of the governor's seat, and I would be amenable to those discussions. So we talked around.
Yeah. So the Republicans who won in 1990 won the governorship. There was a new election in 1994. They won.
Reelected, big. Then Weld resigned.
Then Weld resigned. So
Cellucci
came up from
going to be up in 98.
He was going to be up in 98. That was the third big election in a row for Republicans, and you wanted to be helpful if you could.
Right. However, he thought I could.
Yeah, right. So
2 months later, he called me, asked me to join his cabinet. It was the first cabinet opening he had. I assumed we were getting close to the calendar year of the election. I assumed that meant he had other options, which I was actually fairly relieved about, for a running mate. My name was never in the paper as on his list because I never told anybody but one other person about this conversation, a very discreet person, who gave me the best advice. Well, it depends who you ask. The best advice for eventually securing the seat, which was don't tell anybody. He values confidentiality. Keep it to yourself. I doubt it'll happen. You're too young. Don't have a geographic power base, but stranger things have happened.
Right.
So when he asked me to join his cabinet in a great position, consumer affairs and business regulation, for somebody who's looking for how you make that next step into the private sector.
Right. So this was a continuing on your part, a continuing way to pave a road or bridge over to the private sector from politics by taking a couple of positions in the public sector that were very related to the private sector.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. I was at Consumer Affairs for, I think, a whopping 7 weeks when the governor called me to his office, which, if you've ever been in an appointed position, that's either really good or really bad news. And early in your tenure, it can only almost ever be really bad news. Now, if you ask my husband, it was very bad news. But, basically, it was the Friday before the Super Bowl, so it was late January of '98. Asked me if I wanted to run.
For Lieutenant Governor.
Lieutenant Governor is his running mate, chosen running mate. He had a primary, a tough primary, against the sitting treasurer. I told him that I had already pledged to him that I would do whatever I could to help him if he thought this was the best way for him to get elected. I obviously needed to talk to my husband, give it some thought. And I also told him something that would turn out to be fairly more important than probably the light conversation he and I had at the time, which was I had delayed childbearing and was now heading toward that perilous age of 35. And that it was not something that even a statewide political campaign, I thought, could be delayed any longer. And that, in fact, I might already be, or shortly be, pregnant, and was that an issue for him? And he's a great family man, was very supportive. Both of us, I think, on that front, were very naive about what the public reaction and debates would be. And so I joined his ticket. We announced it that next Tuesday, and I had a positive pregnancy test, I think, on Thursday.
And did when?
2 weeks before the election.
Oh, wow. So there you were, running for lieutenant governor, becoming ever more pregnant. If that's
Absolutely.
a proper way to describe it.
Yes, you don't become less pregnant. Well, eventually, but
right.
the grand finale.
And how did the voters respond to that? What lessons did you carry away from that?
That the debate among women as to what our appropriate roles should be as mothers and how we combine careers and work was far from resolved as I had assumed. And that there was a great deal more resistance and conflict within those issues of motherhood and childbearing than my fairly idealistic, fair and balanced view of the world probably accommodated. And at first, I was just sort of shocked. And in retrospect, only one who has never yet gone through a pregnancy and become a mother for the first time could be as blithe about taking on these challenges as I perhaps at times was. One of my greatest attributes in the Senate, when I was in a very small media network, regional news, not under the glare of the public spotlight, was I have this sort of flip sense of humor that endears people to me in one-on-one or small group conversations, but cannot translate well through a broader medium. And I perhaps, even in those early days of pregnancy, made some fairly blithe, somewhat flip statements.
To the media.
To the media, by extension to the general public, that, I look at now, because I have the value of having every stupid thing I ever said on film, and say, yeah, I remember a conversation with my mother, and I told her I was going to run for lieutenant governor. And she said to me, am I wrong, or are you not soon to be pregnant, or maybe pregnant, or trying to become pregnant? And I said, no. And she said, and so you're going to run a statewide political campaign while you're pregnant? And I said, yes. And she said, have you thought about how hard that might be? And my only comparison, I said, Mom, it's a 9-month campaign. I just ran a grueling uphill 15-month, more like a 2-year campaign, where, you know, I was down by 60 points or something in the first poll. You know, Paul Salucci is the incumbent. It's 9 months. How tough can it be? Which only someone who's never lived through pregnancy can say, because it was tough.
It was tough.
Yeah.
Help us understand, because especially.
Well, I threw up almost every day. You know, that's hard to combine with. First of all, we had
Boisterous campaign, right?
Yeah. At the time of the convention, I wasn't quite to that sort of 3.5 month mark where you want to tell folks you're pregnant, and we sort of knew there might be some dynamics, so we decided not to throw the bomb into a contested Republican convention, which you could assume if there was going to be any concern, that might be the place where it was.
So you didn't disclose until after the
No, but
nomination was
not
secured.
that I was hiding it. I mean, most people wouldn't tell you they're pregnant on day 6.
Right.
But I was feeling the effects of early pregnancy and had broken blood vessels in my eyes, which led one of the fairly, I don't know, how would you describe Andy Hiller? Channel 7 News.
Sassy and savvy.
Yeah, fairly sassy reporters to inquire among his peers as to whether or not they thought there might be a domestic violence issue in my life that they should explore. And he might even have broached that to me, but you know, it's hard to.
Right.
I just sort of laughed about it.
When did you disclose to the voters?
A couple weeks later.
After the convention.
Mm-hmm.
And what was there? You said there was
Immediate attention.
Yeah. What was the media attention like? Did it become a big media
National.
story?
Yeah, I was on 2020. There was a woman, Danielle something, in Washington who's never met me, who basically went on national TV and called me selfish and said that this issue of women who had choices, which they ignored the fact that somebody in my family had to work, and my husband had just passed up a big job because he knew I was pursuing a big job, and he was committed and eventually has and does stay at home, but ignored the details. And this woman said that this is our generation's Vietnam, which perhaps you'd like to take that back considering where we are today in America.
Yeah.
But at the time of peace and prosperity, said that, you know, there are those who choose to serve, meaning to be good mothers and stay at home, and then there are folks like Jane Swift.
Who was selfish by trying to have it all.
Yeah,
Is that what the
basically the
argument?
draft dodgers, you know, abdicating my responsibility.
Wow.
I was stunned.
Wow.
And probably never acknowledged this publicly, but I was hurt. I mean, I'm not sure that there is any more painful accusation than you're a bad mother. And I think whether that's felt internally or really is as powerful to the public as it feels to you personally, I think throughout my tenure, sort of acting as if those, at times, accusations of dereliction of duty and motherhood were irrelevant was not the reality.
So did you find that the majority of women supported you, but there was a vocal minority? Was that the
I
situation
think
you
so.
found yourself?
Although I was surprised that I would go in, the general consensus was that the issue that was raised played to Governor Salucci's advantage. She was a, Republican running in Massachusetts. It got him a chance to see his soft side. In the end, my being on the ticket did matter for the governor's election, but only in the way that any other running mate does, which is geographically. He got much better vote totals in the 4 western counties where I was known, and it was a close enough election that that mattered. So most of the attention was given to my gender, to the pregnancy issue. I don't think if you went back and looked at the numbers that you could find much evidence that the issue colored votes at the end of the day.
It was more your geographic balancing.
The same thing that, you know, every president picks a vice president under. But the thing that's always been interesting is, you know, there's all this smoke, all this discussion, and the, you know, very focused political consultants will tell you ignore it. I don't think you can ignore it, because I think if it went unaddressed,
right,
it could have had a negative impact.
Right.
But I don't think that the positive impact that some attributed to that, and then other aspects of my motherhood and candidacy, I never really saw them. Now that might be because I was a Republican,
Right.
and I think the place that these issues always played out was in my base. And that when you don't have a base, you're very vulnerable in politics or in any leadership position. It'd be like, you know, a colonel not having the support of his troops. So how do you sort of move on from there and build trust among others? So to that extent, I think for Republican women leaders, there are a lot of opportunities. I wouldn't have been on the ticket if I wasn't, a woman. If I was from Medford or, you know, another power base, I might have been, but from North Adams, the geographic calculation helped the governor in the end, but clearly there was a decision to pick me because the differentiating factor was my gender. But I'm not sure in vote totals at the end of the day.
It made that much difference.
It made that much difference.
I see. Okay, that's interesting. Men greeted your gender and your pregnancy. It just didn't seem to matter to them as much as it mattered to women, which is interesting in and of itself.
I think that's the case, although we never did enough polling
Yeah, to know.
to know. And then when we did do polling around the issue, because as some folks know, I was pregnant with twins when I assumed the governor's office. And we were trying to set me up for a political campaign and try to figure out how these issues played. We found it was a very difficult issue to poll, because what people would say in their answers to direct questions was at extreme odds to what they would reveal in what we in the business call verbatims. So people would tell you they don't care at all, you know, she should do whatever she thinks is right, it doesn't impact me.
That's what they'll tell the pollsters.
That's what they'll tell the pollster in answer to, do you care, should it matter?
Right.
And then they'll go to the verbatims, they'll say, tell us, you know, 3 things that you've thought about regarding Jane Swift in the last month, and they'll say, you know, the kids are cute, who's taking care of the kids, what does her husband do? And so the verbatims were full of a discussion about my children, my motherhood, my female credentials, that they had all just disavowed as having any import. And I think that's the issue we struggled with. It always got all the attention. Did it matter?
Yeah, let me just clarify, so for those who haven't followed this evolution of polling and how it works, the verbatims and what they are.
You're going to tell them, or you want me to? Verbatims are open-ended questions.
Yeah, in a poll.
In a poll.
It's not
So,
just different from a focus group. These are just open-ended questions.
right. And so you cannot take, you know, you only identify people by their socio, I guess it's not economic, demographic data. But you get a body of knowledge that sometimes is very revealing, and it usually is the information that if it still perplexes you, you tend to use in a focus group.
Right. So, and it's much more. It gets more expensive.
It's very expensive, and it's I think harder from a research base to quantify it,
Right.
because it's sort of people's sentiments.
Right, right. I've often done, just to and I want to come back to you, but actually going, I had the experience earlier in my life of going to a place which was taking polling and listening to the conversations on the telephone,
Oh.
on the polling, and you get such a different sense when you listen to people's tone
Right.
than if you actually see the data on a piece of paper. You get the nuance and the tonal differences, and you can see when people are being pushed into answers which they don't.
Right.
They're not quite there yet.
Verbatims for
Yeah.
me were a substitute, a poor substitute. But when you go from being in a state senate
Right.
campaign and race, polling I think is of limited value except for a horse race, because if you're running a good campaign, you know what people are thinking because you're
Right.
talking to them and you're meeting them and
Right.
you can sense the trends and you're of them. Folks criticize candidates for using polls at the presidential level, at the gubernatorial level, at the U.S. Senate, but the reality is it is practically impossible to meet enough people to get good data. And so the verbatims sort of substitute for the discussions that you would have in front of a post office in a small town or at the town hall as people are coming in to pay their tax bills. But you don't get tone. And I think that's where folks have tried to use focus groups to try to get a little more of a sense. But in my case, I think we never perfected or figured out how to really get any good handle on what the real impact was of the fact that I was a different person at a different time in their life
I understand.
than another governor in Massachusetts.
Interesting. Interesting. Let's go on with your so you're elected with Governor Cellucci to become the lieutenant governor, and then he resigns. He leaves.
And I'd had a tumultuous year preceding that.
Yeah, now let's see. When you were lieutenant governor, you had your
I had a great first year, and then a series of stupid, petty scandals that I fed into huge controversies
as lieutenant governor.
as lieutenant governor. And
walk
so
us through those a little bit and what you discovered from that.
I
Or one or two. That really
I think the
most
two
vivid.
big ones that people think about, actually, let me talk about all four that added up, because I think the two that were non-gender related are easier to have comparisons and then give you insights into whether or not there was a gender bias in the other two.
Right.
One of the first was this accusation that I was using my staff as babysitters, that I was not good at handling, is not good at addressing, and eventually the Ethics Commission found a potential appearance of a conflict because two young women on my staff babysit, not during office hours, which was generally the perception to this day that people have, that people while they were working were babysitters, but that because they occasionally sat for my oldest daughter at my home after hours, that there could be appearance of a conflict.
Were you paying them out of your pocket?
I actually, this was one of the issues, they didn't want to be paid, and we did prove in all the testimony that they volunteered to do this, and that because they wouldn't be paid, I gave them gifts, as
Right.
anybody would for somebody who volunteered. But yeah, it was,
So that was the issue.
the issue was, would it create a sense within the office that they were getting preferential treatment?
And what did you learn from that experience, the controversy? That
I learned from all of those experiences, but particularly that one, a couple of things. First of all, when you're in a position where you're going to receive a tremendous amount of scrutiny and potentially criticism, which politics is, don't in any way involve your family in the office, because then you open them to the same level of scrutiny and criticism. Secondly, I learned that it was a reinforcement in a much greater sense that there are a lot of conflicts that women in the workforce were having about combining work and family, that it was really tough, and that the outcome in a lot of cases were people resenting the advantages others might have, which is very troubling to me. You would think that sort of a group of people who all are finding it difficult to manage would band together for a common solution, and I think there are some common solutions, but instead I think the place we are today is being a little bit of class warfare, to use a Republican term, I guess, about who has which advantages.
You know, I understand what they were jealous or resentful of the fact that you had access to people on your staff who volunteered to babysit your daughter.
Right.
And that people were jealous. People resented that.
Right. And I think they thought that it was easier for me I think some women felt that I had public resources that made it easier for me to manage my balance.
Right.
Than it was for them.
Right.
And I think some just saw it as an abuse of power. I think because we so poorly explained what was going on. I don't think...
Tell me what you learned about the explanation once you come under scrutiny and there's a controversy. What did you said?
Well, think about what the issues are before you talk.
Yeah, you hadn't had a chance to really sit down and think through
I
how am I
mean,
going to
partly when you're the first person to be sort of address a particular issue, one of the best resources for crisis management is to look at other folks who've done it good and folks who've done it not so well. I now have contributed to the body of folks who've done it not so well. That's my civic contribution to the future. But we didn't have a lot of models. I didn't reach out to a wide enough circle of people to hear their opinions because I felt the criticism very personally and very painfully. And therefore, I sort of shrunk the circle rather than expanding it when I needed to. And also in politics, it's funny, the more people you ask for advice, even if you get the same advice, the general interpretation of how good that advice is portrayed as much better because more people have a stake in saying, oh, she got and she used good advice. So, I mean, there's a really small universe of people who influence public opinion and who influence the people who influence public opinion.
So there's that.
So if I had asked 20 people
right.
and then done the exact same thing, I think it would have been reported very differently about how I handled the analysis of how I handled it. I think it would have been reported differently because I would have had 20 people
who had a stake in what you did.
Right, who are out there saying, no, that was brilliant and this is why, rather than 19 people who are out there saying that was stupid and this is why. Somewhat out of honest evaluation, somewhat out of motivation that if she had asked me, I would have done it better.
Right. So what this really suggests is the political universe of people who are regarded as savvy and are called by the press for their opinions is actually much smaller than one would think.
It's small, but please don't underestimate it.
Yeah,
and
it's powerful.
Very powerful, and I learned, there are two things I learned, and this is getting lit, but I thought the way that I would handle my own personal situation of having lots of demands at work and a new baby at home was to cut out what I inelegantly and flippantly termed the bullshit, which is having lunch with David Gergen, go and sitting down and doing a totally off-the-record coffee with the State House political reporter, finding out what his grandkids were up to, finding then like 6 people who talk all the time and, letting them get to know me. In my little world, I saw that as social and apart from the work. And in what I realized in retrospect is the first thing that I eliminated was the most important thing. Now, I think this would resonate with a lot of working parents. It's really, really difficult. And is it more difficult for mothers than fathers? I don't know. I think that has to be explored, but it's really difficult to go out for drinks after dinner to do a social event that you know in your heart of heart is work, but when your spouse, who's been at home all day taking care of the baby, is still dealing with the wonderful but monotonous and demanding work of taking care of a baby, and you say, the reason I'm not going to be home till 6:30 is because I'm going to the Four Seasons to chit-chat with, this important person.
There's a real conflict here.
Yeah. I mean, how do you, and I think I became really good at it as governor. I think it's going to benefit me in what I'm doing next more than what I did then, because I made great contacts and networks of people that I'll use in my future endeavors. And my husband and I both came to understand how important it was, but even now, when my husband's home with 3 sick kids, as he is this week, and I'm hanging out at the Kennedy School, spending my nights at the Charles Hotel, it's hard. It's hard for the other caregiver who intellectually understands that's work. And I think it's wonderful to have work you enjoy, when you're a parent of young children, because it justifies leaving the house, but it also, on the flip side, is difficult because when you enjoy your work, maybe this is a Catholic thing, but when you enjoy your work and it doesn't always feel like work, it increases the guilt you feel about not being at home. So I learned, talk to a wide circle of people. Their advice can be very valuable, but the fact that you ask them for advice is even more valuable. Make sure you've laid the groundwork. And I think this is particularly true in politics, but I think at any high level, and I think it's the thing women don't always do well, women leaders, is you have to go out and build a network of folks who, when you become attacked, have a vested interest in saving you. And I didn't have any.
Have a network before the trouble hits.
Absolutely. And if you're going to be in a high-level leadership position, trouble will hit. So you can't bet on not having to do that work. And I do think, and there's probably some good studies, that, we talk about in politics, women have a hard time raising money because we don't have these circles. But I think it goes beyond that. These informal circles that men have built up over generations through sports and college and professional organizations are a very powerful tool when you're in public sector.
Right. So in terms of dealing with adversity and knowing that adversity is going to come, some time ought to be spent preparing for it, building your network, trying to make sure you've got the damage control mechanisms in place before the trouble hits, knowing at some point there's going to be a controversy or you're going to hit a rough spot. But if you have your network, and especially as a woman, it's important to pay attention to this because it may not come to you. Men have done this.
It might not be, and especially if you're a Republican in Massachusetts.
Yeah, right. And then when the trouble hits, then also to seek the advice from.
Take your time and be collaborative. You feel this pressure to respond immediately,
right?
And there is a lot of pressure. But the videotape lives forever.
Yeah.
And so I think it probably is more important to do it right than to do it right away.
Right.
And what about your evolution from being a state senator, your business is to persuade, and being an executive, and how your communication style needed to change, but you didn't recognize that right away?
Right. I wasn't good on TV.
Yeah.
I think it's the thing we got back to.
Yeah, that you had to work on that as well. That you were in a different position, there were different expectations.
Different medium. Different ability to.
And because when you were in the state legislature, the medium of choice was probably the newspapers.
Well, and actually, it wasn't even as important as the speeches that I gave to groups in person, to the relationships that I built. That whether they were covered or not, they just didn't have the same impact.
Right.
And so I actually had a reputation as one of the best debaters in the Senate. I was very persuasive with my colleagues. I was very articulate. I just assumed that meant I was good on television.
And?
Not. All my charm just doesn't project. Well, actually, you and I met soon after I was lieutenant governor, or soon after I became governor, and you did what any sort of good person would do, which is you go back, you read some clips, you've already read some stuff because you've been in Massachusetts, and do you remember what you said to me?
I don't remember exactly what I said to you, but what would tell me what I remember talking about your car rides back and forth.
Well, but early on, I would meet lots of people like you who would say to me, "Boy, the press just doesn't capture."
I did say that to you. I did. Your vitality and your
whatever, the whole litany of you're smarter, or you're this or that, and more committed. And for a while, I wrote about this in Boston Magazine, I would cling to that, like, they're wrong, meaning the press.
Right.
And for some reason, they're distorting me.
Right.
Rather than saying, if everybody who meets me in person likes me more than their impression of me on TV,
something's not
that's
working.
a big problem.
Right.
Because most people are only going to know me through TV. And it took me a long time to acknowledge that there are certain tricks of the trade and practice, which was, I think, the other thing in your book, that Ronald Reagan was a great communicator because Ronald Reagan practiced communicating. And that was very helpful, actually.
I've since learned that during the same time, I talked to Ted Sorensen, during the same time that Reagan was learning how to become a speaker, which was during the 50s, he was out continually talking to the audiences. Same thing happened to John Kennedy. After he lost the Democratic nomination for vice president in '56, he turned and became a total politician. He spent the next 4 years traveling the country, giving speeches, and finding his voice, perfecting his language and his presentation, self-presentation, his capacity on television, transformed himself over those times.
Well, I've actually signed up with the Speakers Bureau for some economic reasons, but also...
Yeah, makes a difference.
The more you do it. But I also think giving speeches to groups is different than talking to the public in sound bites and through news media.
I'm tempted to go right there right now, but I want to go back to the scandal questions or the controversy questions, and then come back to television.
Okay, so we did the babysitter.
Yeah, okay.
We had a period of time which the babysitter thing pulled into it. My daughter was about 13 months old. My husband was full-time caregiver. We had moved east, no family around. My daughter got pneumonia, and then my husband got pneumonia. And sort of like most young parents, or parents of young children, which is what we were. We weren't young parents. You get to this point where you say, oh my gosh, I never thought about what do you do when everything falls apart. And everything fell apart for a couple of weeks. And that's when I made some of the decisions that came back to haunt me. And one of the things that I think is important to note, and I'm not sure I've ever shared even in the Boston Magazine article, is we were working really hard. Our view of it was we didn't want the public to think that I couldn't do my job because I had a child. So whereas in retrospect, canceling my schedule until I could figure everything out, until people weren't sick, until I had backup childcare, would have avoided all the problems that we had. A lot of the actions that were criticized in retrospect and that we didn't do a good job explaining happened because we were compensating on the other. Folks on my close staff were petrified to cancel a public event the morning of the event, with the only excuse being the truth, which is her daughter and her husband are sick. And so that's when we started doing makeshift, babysitter routines, but also it's when my daughter came down with pneumonia, thought she was getting better, had a huge conference on regional airports that the governor had 2 other governors coming in from other states for, and I was the master of ceremonies. And I felt that it was impossible to not attend that. The governor was not prepared to be the master of ceremonies. It was actually the very issue that I'd worked on that gubernatorial appointment to Massport. 2 other governors were coming in from other states. At the time, my thought process was, how could I possibly, short of an emergency, say to all these important people, including my boss, for lack of a better word, I can't show up, my daughter's sick. And I guess she was just sick at the time. Anyway, calling home constantly the night before, people weren't having a good night, as sick babies with pneumonia aren't. The next morning, my husband, not even intentionally, and probably doesn't even remember, and I hope he never sees this and is reminded, but said to me, I said, how's Elizabeth? He said, she's fine, she just wants her mother. She was 15 months old enough to articulate that. We all, I guess, want our mothers. But he didn't mean it in any other way. Anyway, later in the day, they had to go back to the doctor. There was a question of whether or not she was going to the hospital. Decision was made that at the end of the conference, rather than me driving the 4 hours home that it would take, because it was a big traffic day, it was a couple days before Thanksgiving, that folks would put me into the state police helicopter and get me home quicker. Turned out to be a huge controversy.
Do you think this was you were accused of using a state helicopter to essentially attend a family affair?
No, actually, early on, we didn't tell people why I took it.
Right.
And I think there was a lot of, first of all, people thought I was accused of doing it to beat the traffic.
To beat the traffic, I see, okay. So, in retrospect, but it did, I remember when it mushroomed into a controversy, Lieutenant Governor used his state helicopter to go home, to fly across Massachusetts. What did you learn from that?
That if people think something's bad, just apologize and move on. I mean, I thought I should make a case. I thought, there were all kinds of examples of other people who'd used the helicopter. It probably was totally appropriate to use the helicopter. In fact, the Ethics Commission ruled that it was. We had these long debates about whether or not we should say why I used the helicopter. In the end, it was all bull. Now, retrospect is so easy, but it was something that...
What do you think you should have done? Come out immediately and said... Come
out immediately, apologized, reimbursed the Commonwealth, and the whole thing would have gone away.
If you'd said, look, it was a misjudgment or part of a lack of...
I just should have said I shouldn't have done it. I think we spent too much time trying to figure out why people were upset, what we should say, how much we were going to tell them,
right,
when it was obvious that the press was in a mood to make it a big issue.
Right.
They were using it more to test me than they were concerned about the issue. And I knew from some press people that all the press wanted me to do was come out immediately, write a check, say I'm sorry, and the whole thing would have gone away. And I didn't do it.
So, and that came on top of the question.
They all actually, I don't want to criticize press people, but that story, the helicopter story, was
right,
in the mix for a long time. Press people knew it was going to be written at some point. We knew the babysitter type story was going to break, and our press person at the time thought it would, a different paper, the other major newspaper had the helicopter story, thought it would be a good idea to let them run with that story on the same day, just to get it all out.
Just to go ahead and get the babysitter story, which hadn't broken yet.
Yeah.
And the helicopter story.
Out on the same day.
And do you think that was a mistake? To get all
Yeah.
the bad news out at once?
Yeah.
You think it was a mistake?
Only because of the dynamics of two competing papers.
Right.
Because one paper won't write about the other paper's scandal.
Right.
But when it became a total scandal, all kind of related in their mind,
right,
they abandoned that generally held principle.
Right. And it just blew up.
Right.
The whole thing mushroomed.
Right.
And you just had to ride it out.
That was the, I didn't, we also, the governor at the time was not in a good mood with the press. And so the day these stories broke, we decided to try our new philosophy. I've got to think of a polite way, even though this isn't a public tape, to say it, but it was basically our go to hell to the press philosophy we decided to implement that day. We had never implemented this philosophy before, but we had been discussing internally that the media sucked and we were victims, more the governor than me, and nobody thought these were big issues, which they weren't at the time. And so we said, you know what, this is a perfect day to unveil. It sounds so stupid, doesn't it?
It's beginning to sound like the perfect storm.
Yeah.
Everything comes together at one time.
We're not going to do what you want us to do, which is send the lieutenant governor out, stand her in front of the office and answer all your questions until you're done. We're going to start playing by our own rules. And so we made this decision that it was much better to give every reporter 20 minutes with me, with a sit down in my office that we thought was much softer, much better, except it's really hard to be, even had I had as refined and good a message as I should have about, I'm sorry, I suck, I'll be a better mother and a better governor tomorrow, or lieutenant governor tomorrow. I didn't have the humble, it took me 6 months to learn to sound humble, which I'm much more humble probably than I ever came across, but apparently humble is not my gig on TV. So, but see, this is how I get myself in trouble. But I didn't know you needed to wear a light-colored suit and lower. There's all tricks. I didn't sound sorry. I probably was more sorry than I sounded. But I couldn't pull it off for an entire day, which it turned out physically scheduling it. I sat in my office for an entire day, and I didn't say this.
One by one.
Yeah, and I got sloppy.
Over time. Had you had one press conference and dealt with it exhaustively?
Well, I did eventually. And then I did very well.
Right.
And it's funny because after this sort of month of hell, I kept getting these stories of, if only she had been this good then. It was like you could never be excused for the mistake, and every good press availability, every good interaction you have with the press afterwards, rather than sort of reversing people's perceptions, were used as further evidence of, well, why couldn't she just have been that good in the beginning? If she had, she wouldn't have caused all these problems.
And you would have cut the legs off the story. You wouldn't have had
it was almost Christmas.
Before it went away?
No, when the story broke. Which is great dead time.
And so it just went on and on and on.
Into like July of the next year, a different time.
Never left.
It never left.
No, I mean, even now, the
Never
stories
left.
will get written.
It's part of the boilerplate.
Yeah. Well, so you survive. You survived these conversations.
I didn't
but, but,
it was
but,
a lie.
but it colored and clouded your political
Absolutely.
profile, and then your governor resigned,
Yeah,
and you became governor. He
Right.
resigned, taking a position in the new Bush resigned, taking
Yes.
a position in the Bush administration. So you were preparing yourself mentally to become governor,
yes.
and that.
Although not physically.
What sense? What does that mean?
Well, I had a very cloak and dagger meeting with my political consultant, media consultant, early on when we knew the governor was probably going to be nominated. And it was a very funny fall of 2000. I don't think the election was decided yet, but it was looking more and more like it was going to be.
Oh, 2002.
Fall 2000, the presidential
I'm sorry,
election.
2000.
And I flew up my political consultant to my farmhouse so folks in Boston wouldn't know that I was starting to prepare myself, but I knew I needed to in the eventuality this happened in Williamstown with only one other aide, where he gave me a probably tough speech for him and appropriate under different circumstances discussion about how I probably had 6 months until the governor would leave, that he had worked with a lot of female candidates, and that as much as this is a difficult conversation for him to broach, I probably should lose some weight because it would change people's perceptions of me. He was one of only 3 people in the room who didn't realize I was pregnant with twins at the time. And so the advice, probably very good, that he was giving was not going to be possible to achieve.
I see. Okay, now.
So I know he's leaving.
Yeah, and you're pregnant. And
Yeah.
you know you're pregnant.
Want to hear a funny story?
Yeah.
Are we supposed to do funny stories or
Yeah,
just
please.
high-minded thinking
No,
it's
no, no,
Harvard?
no.
Day before the election,
This 2000.
2000 election, Governor Cellucci was a huge early supporter of Governor Bush. Until the ballots were counted, a lot of folks were operating under the assumption that it was going to actually be a fairly significant victory, possibly for Governor Bush.
Right.
A lot of states closed that nobody expected. So Governor Cellucci and I go out to lunch in a private room where he shares with me his desire and belief for the first time that he ever voiced it to me, although it was pretty widely assumed and speculated on in the press, that were Governor Bush to win, he would be very desiring of a high-level post in the new administration, and so that I should start to think appropriately and plan. At which point I also told him that I had some news that I thought he might be interested in, that I was actually several months pregnant with twins. And the look on his face, I should have been recording. It was only beat by my father's look when he found out I was pregnant with twins a couple weeks before that. But he was great.
I mean, what was the look?
And then he quickly recovered and was very happy. And to this day, is very happy for me. We have a beautiful family.
Right.
But I am living proof that I and maybe some others have absolutely no idea what your life's going to be like 9 months in advance.
Yeah, wow. And so you were due when?
June 1st.
And so he leaves in April of 2001.
Although I think it was around the inauguration that it was becoming publicly known that he was going to get an appointment. And I think the appointment was announced maybe in like February.
Right, so...
And there was some debate as the Senate confirmation process dragged on, as those things do. External debate. Was it responsible for him to leave the state in the hands of a woman who was pregnant with twins?
God.
Neither of us ever
This
questioned
question
it.
of motherhood and gender just pursued you for many of your political...
Yeah.
your-
And frustratingly, and I mean, even in this interview, it is what's interesting, it is what makes me different, it is where I have some really great stories and good experiences to share. But it really, Massachusetts arguably has some of the best public schools in America today.
Yeah. And what moves
And I
you?
think I had a lot to do with it.
Right, and what moves you in terms of
Right.
public policy?
And
public
we
education?
tried to, I sat at a study group with Tom Payzant, the terrific superintendent of Boston Public Schools yesterday, and talked about issues in public education, and he sort of said, what would really be great someday is if folks at the highest levels of leadership we're used to be could ever bring all our children and youth services together under one umbrella, because it'd be easier for us to coordinate kids and families and schools if that ever happened. I don't think he realized the irony. I tried to do that. Only folks who noticed were those that were against it when I was lieutenant governor and then governor. But major, important policy initiatives, even when they had to do with children or education, which you would think, okay, maybe because people are so fascinated by my gender, by what difference does difference make, by the fact that I'm a mother governing, they'll perhaps pay attention. Before war with Iraq broke out, one of the things dominating the front pages of the New York Times, because of its proximity, but the country was, are our child welfare agencies basically blowing up? There was an awful story in New Jersey. We now have another story in New Jersey. Massachusetts went through that in the early 90s. I, against the advice of some of Governor Cellucci's politically savvy appointees, spent a lot of time quietly and at times publicly working on our child welfare system. We have one of the best public administrators in the country running our child welfare system today. We're not having those problems. We've addressed many of those issues. I think we're a national leader. Still have work to do. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a soul behind maybe the 10 people who really care about that issue, who could tell you, and that would be where the most perplexing and probably fault of mine. If you couldn't even break through on the issue of child welfare because of the dominance and the interest of my own,
your personal situation.
Right, and then it was historic and it was important to people, right. And I have to say that, and Jenny knows this, that some of the nicest things that ever happened to me were the girls that I would meet, who just the fact that I was governor meant a lot to them. So I understand that. And for my own girl, as a mother of 3 daughters, I understand it. And I do think, particularly for kids, the fact that I was a mother made me an even more real sort of model to aspire to.
So to some degree, your gender and motherhood was a very positive asset as a political leader.
Yeah.
That you did become a role model. Other
Right.
people looked up to you and they said, wow, she really is balancing this in ways
Right.
that are very, for a lot of women it was.
But it consumed the things that I don't think at the end of the day people vote on, but they help inform what kind of person you are.
Right.
So dominated the public debate about me for so long that, and I don't know, it may be that when you're first, you can't avoid that.
Mm-hmm.
And so then what does that mean for people, particularly non-traditional leaders, who, how do they think about handling just the firstness, it's not a word, but in a way that allows them to be successful. Who I think a lot about is Carly Fiorina.
Mm-hmm.
Who has been
CEO of Hewlett-Packard.
Probably the first biggest female executive, the first really big company. And a lot of women's organizations have at times been critical of her because she hasn't engaged more in the whole women's progress, women's advancement issues in a very public way, but has been more focused on doing her job, doing it well. And I think that some of that has definitely receded, but she chose, and maybe she had different options, but she chose a model where she, I assume, determined, but it would appear, that just being successful in the position that she was the way to manage being first, and not to engage the broader debates that her being there would engender. Now, it may be that being a public leader, you don't have the same luxury of saying, you know what, I'm just not going to talk about women's leadership while I'm the governor. And there were lots of things that I didn't talk about, because we did try not to feed the issues, but there's a lot of conflict. I mean, there was a lot of conflict when you talk to speechwriters. I mean, it was what people wanted to hear.
They wanted to hear about
How do you do it?
the balancing question.
Yeah.
How do you
They
do
wanted
it?
answers. They wanted solutions, a lot of which I didn't have. It was what interested them. On the other hand, to be out there and taking, by definition, controversial positions, because, you know, anything that's widely debated has some controversy, on an issue that would overshadow everything else and wasn't central to what the voters cared about, wasn't a great political strategy, at least one that had never been proven. And we struggled with that a lot. And Jenny can probably talk
Yeah,
about
Jenny,
that.
how did you struggle with that with speeches?
We tried to find a balance so that, that is what people were interested in, at least a little bit. So you acknowledge it, make a reference here and there, and then use it to grab the audience and get to the meat, what you really want.
How did you make that turn from?
Well, I mean, it's more just not dwelling on it. It's more of an acknowledgement, a light joke here or there.
Don't make news.
You're right. Don't make news. But satisfy people a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and then use it to grab their attention for the important stuff.
But how do you use it to grab their attention?
Well, because then at that point you have them.
And I think we could
That's
do
You
it,
draw them in.
Right, you draw them in with that.
and I think we were more successful in doing it in an individual speech than in the broader media.
Well, right, because there it's a feeding frenzy. You know, when you face the scrum outside the governor's office.
Talk to us about learning about television, being thrust into suddenly realizing that a person who's good on her feet as a speaker is not necessarily good on television, and what you learned about that. What and your tricks of the trade, as you call it.
Well, first of all, I'm going to talk about this in my study group tonight, but appearance matters a lot.
More than one would assume.
So much more. And I think that's true for both genders, but I think it's more so for a couple different reasons. I'm not sure yet how I assign weight to those reasons, but for women, I think it matters more because I go by the multiple mistake theory. If you're the governor of Massachusetts, David, and you get an invitation to go to a black tie dinner at the White House during the NGA meeting,
Mm-hmm.
you don't have a
National
lot of
governors.
decisions. National governors,
Right.
you pretty much know what you're going to wear.
Right.
I guess they could try to figure out if you want the shiny shoes or not the shiny shoes, tails or not tails.
But for a guy, it's
pretty much a no-brainer.
Right.
I get that invitation as governor of Massachusetts. You know, what do you wear?
Why is that hard? Why don't you just wear black? Why is that hard?
Well, you could just wear black, but I mean, that's such a simplistic guy statement. If I was Jane Swift, wife of David Gergen, who was the governor, I'd wear probably sleeveless black. I mean, it's probably about the fanciest invitation you could get.
Right.
And the things that say fashion for women's dress are not necessarily appropriate. But this is another great story. I went to the Gridiron, which is the big Washington dinner.
Right.
Got invited probably because I had children, but I was still the governor.
Right.
You would not believe the fights, the debates, and the discussions over what I was going to wear.
What was the debate?
What was I going to wear?
well,
what was
yeah.
appropriate? So I'll tell you at the end what it came down to. I had this great, I thought, shell with black velvet pants. But I was told by the woman on my staff who was very close to me through my entire tenure as governor. We always have these trusted aides. They have a variety of different titles, but I call her the mean one because she's the one who would have to tell me all the things I didn't want to hear. And we're very close. But the mean one tells me that there is a written rule somewhere, as said by one of the establishers, because there are very few people look by, of fashion for women governors at these events, Christy Todd Whitman, that you cannot reveal your shoulders as a governor, a female governor. I guess a guy probably wouldn't either. So go look for appropriate, very dressy, black tie, even black colored dresses that don't reveal your shoulders. There aren't a lot of them, particularly when it's spring in Washington. So I muddle through, Guess who the Republican speaker was at the Gridiron that year?
Yeah.
None other than Christy Todd Whitman.
Huh?
Guess what she was wearing?
Sure.
Not a stitch on her shoulder. She had a spaghetti strap around her neck. It was the greatest triumph of my entire time with the Mean One. I came back. I was so sorry I didn't have a camera, and I said to her, the Christy Todd Whitman, the ruler of no sleeveless, showed up at the Gridiron, of all places, with barely anything, if anything, concealing her, whatever this is, your neck and collarbone. So anyway, but I mean, it's silly, but it's true. I mean, how do you look like? I was going with the Christian Science Monitor. The Globe was going to be there. I needed dresses that they make for women to dress up. Don't speak and yell at you, Governor.
Yeah.
You know, that's not. They're not made for looking powerful and in control.
Okay, so first thing, worrying about television.
So parents.
You've got to worry about your parents.
And you can make multiple mistakes,
Right.
because there's just so many more variations.
Right.
Facial expressions.
Well, guys have facial expressions, but it didn't work
But-
well for me. But
What do you mean? What are you talking about?
well,
You mean smile?
This is your biggest challenge
yeah,
on TV.
I roll my eyes.
You roll your eyes.
If I think you're stupid, you can pretty much tell.
It's on our mind, it's on our face.
And
Yeah.
so you roll your eyes at the reporters when they ask stupid questions. What you think are stupid questions?
Apparently, even when I managed to control the rolling of the eyes,
Yeah, it's
I revealed in my facial expressions the degree to which I thought they were morons.
yeah, and for Governor Bush, it was the smirk. For you, it was the rolling of the eyes, right?
Right. It was like, you've asked me that 20 times.
Yeah, right.
I've answered it 20 times.
Right.
I know what you're trying to
And
do.
you can't do it in a way that makes it really appealing on television.
Well, it's really, you can, but it takes a lot of practice.
Yeah.
Because you have to watch yourself on the video camera.
Right.
But I also have this concept, there's multiple mistakes, and then for me, there's also the ouch theory, which is, think about the Al Gore alpha male. There's no doubt that men have appearance controversies.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, some research would tell you that it's focused on more for women. I wonder if there isn't a subtler piece that's two-pronged, which is my ouch theory. One is we take it harder.
You take what harder, the criticism?
Criticism of your appearance.
Right.
And when something actually gets to you, it can be harder to find solutions. So is there the fact that in our society, there are different levels of emphasis and perceptions of the importance of appearance for women than for men?
Right.
And does that internal understanding make it harder for women? I mean, it's the reason I call the mean one. I mean, it's a great joke, but it's really hard when somebody says to you, everything that you've ever worn really just doesn't work and you look bad on TV.
Right.
I assume it's hard for guys, but I don't think they internalize it the same way.
That's interesting. Okay, so appearance and then facial expressions. I found on television that television always makes me look older and heavier.
Yeah.
And how does that work for a woman?
And that's the thing. I mean, and this is my other part of the ouch factor,
Right.
is if David Gergen looks heavier on TV,
Right.
does that impact the viewer's sense of your credibility? I think there's a different calculation.
For women?
Yeah.
In what sense?
I think that people assign a heaviness and weight with much less positive attributes for women, or much harsher negative personality traits for women than they do for men.
Mm-hmm. So that put your trimness at a real premium. It was really important to be physically trim as
Right.
possible.
Right.
And one of the questions that you faced was
All the time.
pictures always made you look heavier. The
Right.
stills made you look much heavier.
And-
I was really surprised when I first walked into your office and saw you for the first time. I said, "Whoa,
Right.
this
She's
is
not fat. I think it was two things. And I mean, this gets to the ouch factor by both, I mean,
Right.
how people, it is widely known. It's probably easier for me to talk about because the truth is I am a little thinner today than I was then. But it was a dominant debate, and as much as I didn't read a lot of it, which helped a lot, but the stuff you read, you pretend and you joke with your staff that it doesn't. Of course it impacts you. It's not a nice thing to hear, but you look heavier. I think everybody does on TV. I'd be willing to bet, and you're probably as recognizable because of your TV as I am, if you and I walked around Harvard Square and met people who recognized us, the reactions from the man on the street would be vastly different. I bet people would comment to you, this is my premise, about what you said last week on CNN, whether they agree with your position on Iraq. You'd meet some Republicans who are still mad that you worked for Clinton. If you talked to 50 people who recognized you, and you would know this, but if one, and that might be your mother, said, oh, you look different than you do on TV, that'd probably be about right. I don't think that I have, if I meet 50 people today who recognize me, who've never saw me in person before, I don't think it'd be an exaggeration to say 48, their reaction verbalized, which means it's strong because it's a little inappropriate, is, oh my God, you are thinner, prettier, nicer, which is code for thinner and prettier, because how can they tell how nice you are or not than on TV, is their overwhelming reaction. Which says to me that what I looked like, both in person and on TV, really mattered a lot more to them, and for some reason was more central to their impressions of me than what you look like, whether you're older or heavier.
I see that.
And why is that?
Yeah, it is an issue that women have been, that women anchors on television have dealt with for a long time. Women anchors do not last as long as male anchors, because the age factor starts to really work against them.
And so I have my ouch theory, my multiple mistakes theory, and then I have the Callista Flockhart theory, which is the most controversial, but the truth is, when you look a little heavier on TV, John Madden's been doing commentary on Sunday afternoon football for years, and people are conditioned to seeing heavier men in positions of power and legitimate perspectives. Right. What are, and I think about this a lot as a mother of daughters, think about the women you see through that medium. And with a couple very notable exceptions, Oprah, Rosie, ironically all of which have gone through very public weight gain and loss issues, you have this body image that is, I think widely written, unattainable for most normal women. And so even were I not struggling with weight, can you get to the ideal? And then even if you did, is that really what you want a governor to look like?
Beyond the appearance and questions, what about the substance of what you say and how you say it? Does it make a difference as a woman on television? How you speak?
I think that I think you can't get, I hate to say this, but I think it's really hard to get past the appearance. I think there is such a dominance that what you're going to say in practicing it is extraordinarily important, but it can't be separated from how you're going to present yourself visually. I think for women, there is as much as thinking about all the communications pieces work the same way for women as men in political discourse. Know what your point is, only answer the question with the point that you wanted to make. All those training things I think work very well. But I think that if you believe you can only do those, and because there are some guys who are just really good at making their point, they make really articulate arguments, who can survive on television and can be very persuasive, or at least survive it. I think women can't assume that if you're, an A+ on all those other communication scales and ignore, which is what I did for a long time, the appearance piece, that you can be even moderately successful, because I just think it has such a strong impact on the viewer. And one of the things that we tried to work really hard at is, and I think some news anchors do this too. How do you perfect a look that makes your look not an issue? I mean,
Take the looks out of the question.
Right. Which you would assume means nothing, but it means everything.
Yeah, but let's come back then full circle to this appearance question. And what you learned is sort of the ABCs of appearance. I won't hold you much longer, but you mentioned appearing in light clothes, for example. But
If you're sorry.
Just walk
Yeah.
through, what are the ABCs then of appearance from a woman's point of view?
I think, first of all, my advice would be it's not static. And so I would advise any woman in a leadership position who's going to deal with TV, and that's in business or politics or whatever, to consult professionals because they know. And it's really not all that different. When I got the so-called dress Nazi, who I made fun of, but she was great, who went and redid my wardrobe and bought me all the clothes I needed to wear, she was buying the same blouses for me that she was buying for the news anchors. Now, there are some things that a news anchor could get away with that a governor couldn't, but by and large, there's a look that needs to be current and appropriate for a governor, but I think it changes. And so I don't want to say, you know, wear your hair a certain length and wear a certain color clothes, because I think that changes over time. But I think what is important for women is get to the point where you lose whatever vanity you have, and you basically subject yourself to those whose business is.
Well, what, since there's some women who can't afford to go out and find a professional, you know,
Well, that's a whole other issue.
Yeah.
I think that's a problem. Candidly, I struggled with. One of the most difficult conversations that the mean one and I had, and we're friends, and she knows this, is we were going to do the so-called transfer ceremony, the thing that made history, the picture that went everywhere. I was pregnant with twins. Even if you knew what the look should be for that wardrobe for that day, try to find it.
This is the day when you became governor.
Right. So my staff person did a ton of research, found a boutique on Newbury Street in Boston, which is a ritzy neighborhood, where the woman was willing to work quick because I would outgrow it if we didn't, you know, order it within moments of wearing it. And went out probably 2 weeks before the transfer ceremony, and she fitted me for 2 suits that probably were about as appropriate as you could get, navy for the transfer ceremony, another sort of suit, and she custom made them. $3,000.
Wow.
No one knows that my greatest frustration when I went on bed rest and had my children at 36 weeks was that I wore $3,000 worth of clothes for exactly 4 weeks. I mean, I joke about it now. Can you imagine the conversation between a staff? I was making $100,000 a year, had to maintain a residence in Boston, and had family. My husband had given up his job. We were not living high off the hog. We better than most families, but still, to spend $3,000 for a couple of suits. We didn't have it, but we had to find it and spend it. There's a reason why news anchors, basically, you see at the end of the show, their clothes get donated. And I do think that for women especially, because you have to have a different wardrobe, clothes cost more, the expense factor is one that, I never figured out a way around. Even the woman who helped me to do the wardrobe tried her hardest to sort of find things on sale, but guess what? It costs a lot of money to be dressed like a female governor.
I think it's particularly an issue for young leaders.
That's true.
What makes Jane unique is that, look at the women politicians. Most women delay leadership because of childbearing. So the vision, people have Margaret Thatcher in their minds. You look at the women who have been governors, they're all older governors. That buys you a lot. But if you want to be a young leader, the appearance issue is much more of a factor. Someone who's really pulled it off is Jennifer Granholm in Michigan. But she's rare.
She's how old now? She's in her 40s?
I think her early 40s.
And she's probably an inspiring, brilliant person, but the irony of a former beauty queen being able to affect this effortless and seamless sort of transition onto the big public stage wasn't lost on me. I mean, I used to say to people, in being flip, but you know, if I had had cheekbones as a kid and thought that my currency was, you know, my looks, I would have gone and been a model or an actor or something. But all of a sudden, you're thrown into this business where some of the measurements of your success are going to be based on the same thing. And, you know, I wouldn't have made that choice. I knew that wasn't my strength. And I was stubborn.
Yeah. Jenny, I'm very curious, as a Kennedy School graduate coming now to work for a woman governor, what you learned about gender and leadership. What were the main lessons that you could
It's a lot harder than I thought. Being a woman leader, it's a lot harder. I mean, we studied it in the abstract, and, you know, I come from a family like Jane's where girls can do anything, so I don't even think about these things. And all of a sudden, it hits you. And it really hits you when you're trying to craft a speech, and every word counts, particularly for somebody who's under such scrutiny. You really don't, you don't feel like there's any room for error at all. And you want to find the appropriate words to talk about motherhood. You want to find the appropriate words to talk about controversial issues that don't make her look, you know, too sappy or too callous. It's really a balancing act that I think you don't necessarily have to walk. And I've written speeches for male politicians. It certainly was different. Certainly, you just get away with a lot more.
In the end, was it worth it?
Absolutely. I mean, I love public policy, and whether anybody ever knows it or not, we have a functioning, which is saying a lot, child welfare system in Massachusetts today. We have great public schools. I'll send my daughters to them. And it's because of some of the work we did. You can't have that kind of impact. And it comes with a price. Do I wish I had sort of won the lottery and gone through the wardrobe transformation and started my running routine and done all the things that, you know, knew everything I knew? Sure, but most people don't get that luxury. And I firmly believe that at, you know, age 38, I'm a better mother, I'm a better person, and I have more to contribute in the future on a whole number of fronts because of the intense experiences that I had. So, you know, you pay the price. There were tough days. I'm not sorry to have a little break. But even the break helps me to put them in perspective and to share them in perhaps a more candid way than I could, that maybe hopefully makes it different. And I do think we saw a little bit of that. She probably wouldn't say it yet, but the female candidate for governor on the Democratic side, I think, had a little more maneuvering room, maybe a lot more on certain issues, because of the press's own reflection of the way in which they dealt with some of these new issues. And let me just say one last thing, and this isn't to try to cover my own butt, but it really is the big point of debate in my household. I am not bitter with the press. What I came to realize is the press is a reflection of society, and that's a little more distressing because the work that needs to be done. If I just had to, you know, go over to the Shorenstein Center and convince all the press people who come through to change the way they cover women politicians, that's a scalable, doable project. I think it's bigger than that, and that's probably the piece that is gives me energy to talk about some of these things, but I think it's a little bit more depressing than those who would say it's just a media problem. I think there are still a lot of conflicting sentiments in society and a lot of issues we need to resolve for our daughters so that they don't face the same things.
Right, right. Well, my sense is, Jane Swift, that we will see you in the public arena again. But in the meantime, congratulations for the service that you did perform for the good people of Massachusetts, and thank you for taking the time here with you and Jenny Armini.
Thank you.
We appreciate both of you very much. It's good to have you back here in our
Thank
midst
you.
as well.